I was standing in the parking lot behind my second job, my breath fogging in the cold air, my feet aching so badly I could barely feel my toes, when my phone buzzed with a message from my dad. It was close to midnight, Christmas lights flickering weakly on the brick wall across from me, and all I could think about was how many hours I still had to sleep before doing it all over again tomorrow. The message was cheerful, almost giddy. "Come home early for Christmas. We have a big surprise this year." I remember smiling despite myself, because part of me still wanted to believe that all of this, the double shifts, the skipped meals, the constant exhaustion, was worth it for moments like that. As I unlocked my car, my phone buzzed again, this time with a notification from social media. I tapped it without thinking. And there it was. My sister, standing in our parents' driveway, laughing with her hands on the hood of a brand new red Ferrari. The kind of car I had only ever seen in magazines or behind velvet ropes. My chest tightened as I stared at the photo, my mind racing through numbers I knew by heart. Rent, insurance, tuition. The money I had sent home every single month without fail, all year long. That was the moment I realized I hadn't been a daughter in a very long time. I had been a wallet. I sat in my car with the engine off, staring at that picture until the screen dimmed. The parking lot was almost empty now, just one flickering streetlight and a couple of abandoned shopping carts rattling in the wind. I should have driven home, should have gone to sleep, but my hands were shaking too much to turn the key. My sister's smile was so wide, so effortless, and my dad was standing just out of frame, I could tell. He was always nearby when something big happened for her. What hurt wasn't just the car. It was how normal it looked to them, how natural it seemed that she would get something so extravagant while I was counting quarters at a vending machine between shifts. I kept thinking maybe there was an explanation. Maybe the money hadn't come from me. Maybe it was a loan or a miracle or anything other than what my gut already knew. But deep down, a familiar voice whispered, the same one I had ignored for years. "You already know where that money came from." I closed my eyes and leaned my forehead against the steering wheel, feeling the weight of the day press down on me. My dad's words echoed in my head, words he had used so many times before. "You're the strong one. You understand." I had built my whole life around being the one who understood. I am 30 years old, and I live in a small apartment in a city I moved to on my own because I believed independence was something to be proud of. During the day, I work a full-time job that looks respectable on paper, the kind you tell relatives about at holidays. At night, I put on a different uniform and work until my legs tremble and my smile feels glued on. I don't do it because I love working. I do it because being the responsible one in my family has never been optional. Somewhere along the way, responsibility stopped being a phase and became my identity. When people hear that I work 2 jobs, they usually tell me how strong I am. They say it like it's a compliment, like it doesn't come with a cost. They don't see me eating dinner out of a plastic container in my car. They don't see me choosing which bill can wait another week. And they definitely don't see the monthly transfers leaving my bank account, labeled with words like help or family, as if that made it simpler. I never told myself I was being taken advantage of. I told myself I was doing the right thing. My dad has always had a way of asking without really asking. It would start with a phone call, his voice heavy with concern, talking about how things were tight this month or how unexpected expenses kept popping up. He never demanded anything. He didn't have to. He would remind me how grateful he was, how proud he was of me, how lucky the family was to have someone like me, and every time I sent the money. At first, it really did feel temporary. A bridge until things stabilized, a way to keep everyone afloat. My sister, on the other hand, never had to bridge anything. She is younger than me, softer around the edges, still figuring things out, according to everyone else. When she struggled, it was treated like a delicate situation that needed protection. When I struggled, it was proof that I could handle more. No one ever said that out loud, but it was woven into every interaction. I paid bills, she followed dreams, I covered gaps. She got space to breathe. Sitting in that dark parking lot, I thought about all the times I had pushed through exhaustion because I believed it mattered. I thought about holidays when I arrived late because of work, apologizing for being tired. I thought about how often I had been told, "You don't need much," as if my needs were optional. That picture of the Ferrari burned in my mind, glossy and unreal, and suddenly all those little moments lined up into something I couldn't ignore anymore. I finally started the car and drove home, the road empty and quiet. Christmas music played softly on the radio, songs about joy and togetherness that felt like they belonged to someone else's life. As I drove, I tried to calm myself down, telling myself not to jump to conclusions. I told myself families didn't keep score. I told myself I was overreacting. I had said those words to myself so many times that they felt automatic. But when I pulled into my apartment complex and turned off the engine, the silence felt different, heavier. I sat there for a long time, staring through the windshield, replaying the message from my dad and the image of my sister's new car. The truth was uncomfortable, and that's why I had avoided it for so long. I liked being needed. I liked believing my sacrifices held the family together. If I stopped believing that, I wasn't sure who I would be anymore. Inside my apartment, I dropped my bag by the door and sank onto the couch without even turning on the lights. The room smelled faintly of laundry detergent and cold coffee. This was the space I paid for, the life I maintained mostly on my own, and yet it felt like a temporary station between obligations. I pulled out my phone again and looked at the picture one more time. The comments underneath were full of congratulations and heart emojis. No one mentioned where the money came from. No one ever did. I thought about Christmas morning, about driving back to my parents' house, about walking into a room where everyone would be smiling and waiting for my reaction. I imagined myself forcing a smile, congratulating my sister, pretending that my chest didn't hurt. That had always been my role, to smooth things over, to make things easier for everyone else. I wondered when it had stopped being okay for things to be easier for me too. As I lay there in the quiet, I realized that this wasn't just about one car or one holiday. This feeling of being unseen hadn't started tonight. It had been building for years, layered under responsibility and obligation and praise that only came when I gave more. The Ferrari was just the first thing big enough, loud enough, to shatter the story I had been telling myself. That night, I didn't sleep much. I stared at the ceiling, listening to the hum of the city outside my window, thinking about how close Christmas was and how far away my family suddenly felt. I still didn't know what I was going to do. I still wanted to believe there had been some mistake. But somewhere deep inside, something had shifted. I had seen the picture and I couldn't unsee it. And for the first time in a very long time, I wondered what would happen if I stopped being the one who always understood. I stayed in my car longer than I needed to that night, long after the engine had gone quiet, because part of me was afraid to walk inside and sit with the truth. It was easier to pretend this was just exhaustion talking, that I was reading too much into one picture on a screen. I told myself I wasn't angry. I told myself I was just tired. But as the cold seeped through the windows and into my bones, a question I had been avoiding finally surfaced, clear and sharp. When did helping my family stop being help and start becoming my responsibility? The uncomfortable truth was that it hadn't happened all at once. There was no single moment where I could say, "This is when everything changed." It had crept in slowly, disguised as love, wrapped in words like family and sacrifice. In the beginning, I had been proud to be the one they leaned on, proud that when things got hard, they thought of me first. I had worn that role like a badge of honor, never questioning what it was costing me. A few years earlier, before I picked up the second job, my dad had called me one evening sounding tired in a way that made me sit up straighter on the couch. He told me things were tight, that a few unexpected expenses had come up, that he just needed a little help until things stabilized. He didn't ask outright. He never did. He just talked, letting the silence stretch until I filled it. I remember saying yes almost immediately, reassuring him that it was no problem, that I had it covered. When I hung up, I felt useful, needed, loved. That first transfer felt temporary, like a bridge. I told myself it was what families did. When one person stumbled, another stepped in. I didn't think of it as sacrifice back then. I thought of it as teamwork. I was working full-time, doing okay, and the idea that my money could ease their stress made me feel closer to them, even from miles away. But the calls didn't stop. They just changed shape. One month it was a repair that couldn't wait. Another month it was insurance that had gone up unexpectedly. Then it was my sister's tuition, framed as an investment in her future. Each time the amount crept a little higher, the urgency a little sharper. And each time I said yes, because saying no felt like betraying the role I had already accepted. That was when I took the second job. I told myself it was temporary too, just until things settled down. I remember standing in the break room during training, listening to someone joke about side hustles and laughing along like it was all part of some exciting phase. But it wasn't exciting, it was exhausting. My days blurred together into a cycle of alarms, commutes, and aching feet. I learned how to run on coffee and stubbornness, how to smile when my body begged me to stop. Most mornings, my alarm went off before the sun came up. I would lie there for a few seconds, staring at the ceiling, gathering the energy to swing my legs out of bed. I learned to move quietly, efficiently, like any extra motion was wasted effort. Breakfast was whatever I could grab on the way out the door. Lunch was eaten at my desk or in my car. By the time my second shift started, my mind felt fuzzy, but I pushed through because there was always another bill, another transfer, another reason not to slow down. I told myself this was just what being responsible looked like. I told myself other people had it worse. And when my dad called to thank me, his voice warm and grateful, it felt like proof that I was doing the right thing. He always ended those calls the same way, telling me how proud he was, how lucky they were to have me. Those words mattered to me more than I wanted to admit. What I didn't do was keep track. Not really. I didn't add up the numbers or ask for timelines. I labeled the transfers with gentle words that softened the reality of what I was doing. Help, family, just this once. It felt wrong to treat my own parents like a transaction. Families didn't keep score. That's what I told myself every time a small voice in my head whispered that something wasn't adding up. Meanwhile, my sister floated through her 20s in a way I had never been allowed to. She changed jobs, took breaks, talked about finding herself. Whenever she struggled, it was treated like a delicate phase, something to be handled with care. My dad worried about her in a way that felt protective, almost tender. No one ever worried about me like that. They assumed I was fine because I always made it work. I remember one phone call in particular, after a 14-hour day that left my legs shaking as I stood in line for gas. My dad mentioned casually that my sister was thinking about switching programs again, that it might mean a little extra expense for a while. I was quiet, calculating in my head how many more shifts that would mean for me. Before I could say anything, he added, "You're good at this stuff. You always figure it out." It wasn't a question. It was a statement. And somehow that hurt more than if he had asked. There were moments when the weight of it all pressed down on me so hard I had to pull over just to breathe. Nights when I sat on the edge of my bed, shoes still on, too tired to move. I missed birthdays. I skipped holidays. When coworkers talked about weekends away or spontaneous plans, I smiled and nodded, already thinking about my schedule. Every choice I made was filtered through one question. How much can I send this month? And still, I didn't think of myself as a victim. I thought of myself as dependable, the one who didn't need rescuing, the one who could be counted on no matter what. There was a strange comfort in that, even as it drained me. Being needed felt safer than admitting how lonely it was to carry everything alone. The money never came back, not once. No one said it would, not explicitly, but the word temporary had been used so many times that I assumed it was implied. I didn't notice when temporary turned into expected. Or maybe I noticed and chose not to see it. Every time I considered asking about repayment, my chest tightened with guilt. What kind of daughter counted money like that? So I didn't ask. I just worked more. I adjusted my budget. I told myself I could rest later. And when my sister talked excitedly about plans, about things she wanted to do next, I listened and smiled, because that was easier than admitting how uneven everything felt. Sitting there after seeing the picture of the Ferrari, all of that came rushing back to me in a way it never had before. Every late night, every skipped meal, every transfer I sent without question. I realized how long it had been since anyone had asked me how I was really doing. Not in the casual way people ask out of habit, but in the way that means they actually want to know. I thought about Christmas coming up, about driving home and slipping back into my usual role, the helpful daughter, the strong one, the one who understood. I had always believed that if I just kept going, kept giving, things would eventually balance out. That fairness had a way of finding you if you were patient enough. But as I finally climbed out of my car and headed inside, the cold biting at my face, I felt something new stirring under the exhaustion. A quiet unease. A sense that maybe I had misunderstood my role all along. Maybe the reason things never felt settled was because they weren't meant to. And as much as I wanted to believe this was all just a misunderstanding, I couldn't ignore the thought that kept returning, heavier each time. I had been holding everything together for so long that no one remembered what it was like without me. And the scariest part wasn't how much I had given. It was the growing realization that no one had ever planned on giving anything back. I didn't start questioning things because I wanted to find fault. I started because my body was finally forcing me to slow down, and in that stillness, patterns I had ignored for years began to surface. The truth is, favoritism doesn't always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it hides behind soft words, behind concern, behind what looks like love. And in my family, it had always worn a very familiar face. Growing up, my sister and I were treated differently in ways that were easy to excuse at the time. She was the younger one, the sensitive one, the one who needed more attention. I was the capable one, the independent one, the one who didn't need as much. When she cried, people rushed to comfort her. When I struggled, I was told I'd figure it out. That difference seemed small back then, almost logical. Someone had to be strong, and I had learned early that it was going to be me. As adults, that dynamic didn't disappear. It just changed shape. My sister's mistakes were met with understanding. Mine were treated as learning experiences I should handle on my own. If she changed her mind about school or work, it was framed as growth. If I hesitated or expressed doubt, it was seen as unnecessary stress. I didn't resent her for it, not consciously. I loved her. But I couldn't ignore how often her comfort came before my stability. I remember a family dinner not long ago, one of the few times we were all together. My sister was talking about how overwhelmed she felt, how life was moving too fast. My dad leaned forward, concern etched into his face, asking what she needed, what could be done to make things easier for her. When the conversation turned to me, he smiled and said, "You're always so put together. I don't worry about you." Everyone laughed, like it was a compliment. I laughed too, even though something in my chest tightened. That sentence stayed with me longer than it should have. "I don't worry about you." It sounded harmless, even kind, but underneath it was an assumption that I didn't need care, that I didn't deserve the same softness. Being dependable had become a way for people to excuse not showing up for me. And the more dependable I was, the less anyone questioned whether I needed anything in return. When money entered the picture, that imbalance became impossible to ignore. My sister never had to ask how the bills were being paid or where the money came from. She was protected from that stress, shielded from the reality of adult responsibilities. Meanwhile, my financial contributions were treated like a given, a resource that existed because I existed. No one asked if it was hard for me. No one wondered what I was giving up. There were moments when I tried to speak up, small ones, tentative ones. I would mention how tired I was, how long my days felt. The responses were always the same. "You're just overworked." "You're too hard on yourself." Or worse, "You chose this." The implication was clear. If I was exhausted, it was my own doing. If I was struggling, it was because I hadn't managed myself better. That framing made it impossible to ask for help without feeling weak or ungrateful. My sister, on the other hand, was never told she chose her struggles. They were treated as things that happened to her, things she needed support to get through. I watched that contrast play out over and over again, telling myself it didn't bother me, that it was just how families worked. But each time I swallowed my feelings, something inside me hardened a little more. I started to notice how often my needs were minimized, not out of cruelty but out of habit. If I mentioned wanting to take a break, someone would remind me how lucky I was to have opportunities. If I talked about stress, it was reframed as ambition. My discomfort was always reinterpreted into something more acceptable, something that didn't require anyone else to change. One afternoon, after a particularly long stretch of work, I called my dad just to hear a familiar voice. I didn't ask for anything. I just wanted to talk. The conversation drifted, as it always did, toward my sister. He told me about her plans, her worries, the things she was excited about. When I mentioned how busy I'd been, there was a brief pause, then he said, "Well, you've always been good at handling things." The call ended soon after. I hung up feeling strangely empty, like I had reached out and found nothing there to catch me. That was when I started to understand that being the responsible one had come with an unspoken rule. I wasn't supposed to need reassurance. I wasn't supposed to ask for balance. My role was to give, not to receive. And as long as I played that role well, everyone else could remain comfortable. I tried to tell myself that this wasn't favoritism. That word felt too harsh, too accusatory. I told myself it was just circumstance, just personality differences. But the more I replayed moments from my life, the harder it was to deny the pattern. When resources were limited, they flowed toward my sister. When sacrifices were required, they flowed toward me. That wasn't coincidence. That was a system. What hurt the most wasn't that my sister was supported. It was that my support was invisible. The checks I sent, the hours I worked, the exhaustion I carried, none of it seemed to register as something that cost me anything. It was as if my capacity was endless in their eyes, a well that could never run dry. I started asking myself uncomfortable questions. If I stopped helping, what would happen? Would anyone notice the absence, or would they just be angry that the safety net was gone? I didn't like where those questions led, so I pushed them aside. It felt disloyal to even think them. But then there were moments that forced the truth closer, like the time my sister casually mentioned a purchase she was excited about, something expensive that she brushed off as no big deal. I knew without asking that money had come from somewhere, and I knew it hadn't come from her. The realization didn't make me angry right away. It made me tired in a way I couldn't shake. I began to see how often my family framed my contributions as choices rather than necessities. I chose to work more. I chose to help. I chose to send money. That language conveniently removed their responsibility from the equation. If it was my choice, then they didn't owe me anything in return. Not gratitude, not consideration, not fairness. One evening, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I tried to imagine what my life would look like if I wasn't carrying everyone else's weight. The thought felt almost foreign, like imagining a life in another country. I didn't know who I would be without that role, and that scared me more than exhaustion ever had. The picture of the Ferrari lingered in my mind, not as a shock anymore, but as a symbol. It represented everything that had been quietly wrong for years. The imbalance, the unspoken expectations, the way love had become conditional on how much I was willing to give. I wasn't ready to confront anyone yet. I wasn't even ready to admit all of this out loud. But something fundamental had shifted. I could no longer tell myself that things were fair in their own way. I could no longer ignore the fact that my sister was protected while I was relied upon, and that those two roles were never meant to be equal. As Christmas drew closer, I felt a growing sense of unease that I couldn't name. I went through my routines on autopilot, working, saving, sending money, but it all felt heavier now. The blind trust I had placed in my family's intentions was cracking, and once it did, I couldn't put it back together. For the first time, I allowed myself to think the unthinkable, that maybe love shouldn't require this much erasure, that maybe being strong shouldn't mean being overlooked, and that maybe the story I had been telling myself about my place in my family wasn't the whole truth. I didn't know what I was going to do with that realization yet. But I knew this much. Favoritism wasn't just about who got more. It was about who was expected to give without ever being asked what it was costing them. And for the first time in my life, I understood exactly which side of that line I had been standing on. I didn't sit down to count the money because I wanted to accuse anyone of anything. I sat down because I was exhausted in a way sleep couldn't fix, and I needed to understand why. It was a quiet Tuesday night, the kind where the world feels paused. I had come home from my second job, kicked off my shoes by the door, and stood in my kitchen staring at nothing. My hands were still trembling slightly, not from anger, but from fatigue. I opened my laptop, telling myself I would just check one thing, just to get my bearings, just to remind myself I wasn't imagining how heavy everything felt. I logged into my bank account and pulled up my transfer history. At first, I didn't even scroll. I just looked at the most recent transaction, the familiar line I had seen every month for years. Same amount, same destination, same quiet sense of obligation. I leaned back in my chair and exhaled, telling myself not to be dramatic. Then I scrolled. The numbers kept going. Month after month, year after year, a steady stream flowing out of my account like a tide I had never bothered to measure. I hadn't realized how long it had been since I'd actually looked at the full picture. I had always focused on the next bill, the next shift, the next transfer. Seeing it all lined up like that did something to me. It made everything real in a way it hadn't been before. I started adding it up slowly, carefully, afraid of what I might find if I rushed. My finger traced the screen as I whispered the numbers to myself. Rent assistance, insurance, tuition, emergency help, just this once. The total climbed higher than I expected, higher than I wanted to believe. I stopped halfway through and closed my eyes, my stomach tightening. I wasn't angry yet. I was stunned. This wasn't spare change or a few bad months. This was a pattern. A commitment no one had ever named, but everyone relied on. I remembered every conversation attached to those numbers. My dad's voice, calm but strained, explaining why things were tight again. The way he always framed it as temporary, as something we would laugh about later. Just until we get back on our feet, he would say. I had believed him every time. I wanted to believe him. The idea that my sacrifices were helping stabilize the family gave meaning to the exhaustion. But as I stared at the screen, I realized something that made my chest ache. There had never been an end date. Not once had anyone said, "This is the last time." Temporary had quietly become permanent, and I had never been invited into that decision. I had just absorbed it, like I always did. I scrolled further back, to the first transfer. I could still remember where I was when I sent it, sitting on my couch in my old apartment, feeling proud that I could help. I had been so sure it was the right thing to do. Looking at it now, I felt a strange mix of tenderness and sadness for the version of myself who thought this would be short-lived. My phone buzzed on the counter, startling me. For a split second, my heart jumped, irrationally afraid that someone could see what I was doing. It was just a text from my dad, asking how work was going, adding a smiley face like he always did. I stared at it for a long moment before replying, "Busy, but okay." It was the truth I always gave, the one that didn't require follow-up. I almost closed my laptop then, almost convinced myself that I didn't need to know more. But something kept me there, my hand resting on the trackpad, my eyes drawn back to the numbers. I kept scrolling until I reached the most recent months, the ones where my hours had increased, where my own savings had stalled. The realization crept in quietly, settling in my chest like a weight. I wasn't just helping, I was sustaining. The next day, the thought followed me everywhere. At my desk during my first job, as emails piled up. Behind the counter at my second job, as I smiled at customers and rang them up. The numbers replayed in my head, not as guilt, but as clarity. For the first time, I wasn't thinking about how to manage it. I was thinking about what it meant. That evening I called my dad, not to confront him, not to demand answers. I told myself I just wanted to check in. His voice was warm when he answered, relaxed. We talked about small things at first, the weather, his plans for the week. I could hear my sister laughing in the background, her voice light and carefree. When there was a pause, I took a breath and asked, as casually as I could, about one specific expense I had helped cover recently. There was a brief silence on the line. Then he chuckled softly. "Why are you worrying about that?" he said. "Everything's fine. You're always stressing yourself out." His tone wasn't defensive. It was dismissive in a way that made my throat tighten. I tried to explain that I was just trying to plan, just trying to understand where things stood. He cut me off gently, telling me not to overthink it, reminding me that we were family. Family. The word landed heavily between us. It was always the end of the conversation, a way to shut things down without answering anything. I felt myself nodding even though he couldn't see me, apologizing without knowing what I was apologizing for. By the time we hung up, I felt smaller than I had before the call. I sat there afterward, phone in my hand, replaying the exchange. He hadn't lied, he hadn't raised his voice, but he also hadn't answered me. And somehow, I was the one who felt guilty for asking. That realization hurt more than any argument would have. It made me see how often my questions were reframed as problems, how my need for clarity was treated like unnecessary stress. Over the next few days, I started noticing things I had brushed off before. My dad talked about money with a looseness that hadn't been there in years. He mentioned plans, upgrades, ideas that made me pause. My sister spoke excitedly about the future, about possibilities that felt strangely untethered from reality. No one talked about budgets. No one talked about limits. And no one talked to me. I didn't say anything. I watched. I listened. I told myself I was being paranoid, that I was reading too much into casual comments. But the unease grew anyway, a quiet hum under everything I did. I found myself flinching every time my phone buzzed, bracing for another request disguised as a conversation. One afternoon, after another long shift, I sat in my car and stared at the steering wheel, too tired to drive. I thought about how often I had rearranged my life around other people's needs, how many times I had told myself I could rest later. Later had never come. I wondered, not for the first time, what would happen if I didn't catch them the next time they fell. The answer scared me, not because of what it meant for them, but because of what it revealed about my place in the family. I had become the solution to problems I wasn't allowed to fully understand. I was trusted with responsibility, but not with transparency. I was relied upon, but not consulted. That night, back at home, I opened my laptop again. I didn't add the numbers this time. I just looked at them, letting them exist without explanation. I realized that counting hadn't made me angry. It had made me aware. Awareness was quieter, but it was heavier. It settled into my bones and stayed there. I closed the laptop and sat in the dark, listening to the faint sounds of the city outside my window. Somewhere, my sister was dreaming about her future, and my dad was planning the next step without thinking about how it would be funded. And I was here, finally seeing the shape of the role I had been playing. I wasn't ready to do anything yet. I wasn't ready to change the pattern or challenge it. But something had shifted inside me. I could feel it, like a door that had cracked open and refused to close again. I had counted the money, and in doing so, I had counted myself. For the first time, I couldn't unsee the truth. The sacrifices I had made weren't invisible because they were small. They were invisible because they were expected. And as I sat there, the weight of that realization pressing down on me, I knew that whatever came next, things would never feel simple again. Christmas had always been the one time of year when I let myself believe things would feel fair. No matter how tired I was, no matter how stretched thin my life had become, I held on to that hope like a quiet promise to myself. Christmas meant coming home. It meant sitting at the same table, hearing the same stories, pretending for a few days that we were all equals again. As I packed my bag and checked my work schedule for the last time before the drive, I told myself this year would be different. This year, all the sacrifices might finally feel worth it. The drive home was long and familiar, the highway stretching out in front of me under a pale winter sky. Christmas songs played softly on the radio, and I found myself humming along, even though my chest felt tight. I kept thinking about my dad's message, about the excitement in his voice when he said there was a surprise waiting. I tried not to think about the picture I had seen, about the way it had lodged itself in my mind. I told myself not to jump ahead. I had done that too many times before and always regretted it. When I pulled into my parents' driveway, the house looked exactly the same as it always had. Lights twinkled along the roofline, the front windows glowing warmly. For a moment, standing there with my engine idling, I felt a wave of relief. This was home. Whatever doubts I had carried with me felt smaller in the face of that familiar sight. I grabbed my bag, took a deep breath, and walked inside. The first thing I noticed was the noise. Laughter filled the house, louder and brighter than I expected. My dad greeted me with a hug that felt hurried, distracted. My sister appeared a second later, her smile wide, her energy almost buzzing. She looked different. Not older or younger, just charged with a kind of excitement I hadn't seen in a long time. I told myself it was just the holiday spirit, but something in my stomach twisted. No one asked about my drive. No one asked if I was tired. The conversation moved around me, not toward me. I followed them into the kitchen, setting my bag down quietly, slipping back into the role I knew so well. The helper. The one who filled in the gaps. I started unpacking groceries, offering to help with dinner, doing what I always did. It felt automatic, like muscle memory. As the afternoon went on, I noticed the small things. My dad kept checking his phone, smiling to himself. My sister was unusually quiet whenever I looked directly at her, then overly animated when she turned away. There was a sense of anticipation in the air, like everyone was waiting for a cue I hadn't been given. I laughed when they laughed, nodded when they talked, but the unease kept building, a low hum under everything. At one point, my dad clapped his hands together and said something about this being a special Christmas. He looked at my sister when he said it, not at me. I felt a familiar sting, quickly buried under years of practice. I told myself I was imagining it. I had spent too much time alone lately. I was reading too much into things. Dinner was busy and loud. I moved around the kitchen, setting plates, refilling glasses, doing the small tasks that kept everything running smoothly. No one asked me to. They never had to. This was the role I had perfected. At the table, conversations overlapped, stories bounced back and forth. I smiled and listened, adding a comment here and there, though it felt like my words floated away before anyone could catch them. My dad made an offhand remark about how hard I worked, the kind of comment that sounded like praise but landed hollow. "You're used to it," he said, as if that explained everything. "You don't need much." The table laughed softly, and I laughed too, even as something inside me shrank. It wasn't the first time I'd heard that sentence. It was just the first time I really heard what it meant. After dinner, we moved into the living room. The Christmas tree glowed in the corner, presents stacked neatly underneath. I sat on the couch, hands folded in my lap, watching my sister pace slightly, her excitement barely contained. I felt like a guest in my own family, waiting for instructions on how to react. A part of me still hoped the surprise my dad had mentioned would be something harmless, something small that I could smile through without effort. For a moment, there was a calm I hadn't felt in a long time. The house smelled like pine and food and warmth. I leaned back against the couch, letting myself believe that this was what family was supposed to feel like, that maybe I had been wrong to question things, that maybe all the tension I had been carrying would dissolve once we were together. Then I noticed the keys. They were sitting on the coffee table, slightly apart from the rest of the clutter. Not house keys, not old, worn car keys. These were sleek and unfamiliar, the kind you notice even when you're not looking for them. My eyes kept drifting back to them, drawn by something I couldn't name. I watched as my dad glanced at them, then at my sister, a quick look passing between them. "What are those?" I asked lightly, my voice casual, like I didn't already feel a knot forming in my stomach. My sister's laugh was too quick. "Oh, nothing," she said. "Just something Dad's been dealing with." My dad cleared his throat and changed the subject, talking about dessert, about coffee, about anything else. The keys stayed where they were, silent and heavy. I told myself to let it go. I had ruined enough moments in my life by asking questions that made people uncomfortable. I focused on the tree, on the lights, on the soft glow filling the room. I reminded myself that Christmas wasn't about things. It was about being together. It was about showing up. Later that night, as everyone started to drift off, I went upstairs to the guest room. I lay on the bed staring at the ceiling, listening to the muffled sounds of the house settling around me. Laughter echoed faintly from downstairs, followed by the low murmur of voices. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was light, celebratory. I felt strangely separate from it, like I was listening through a wall I hadn't realized was there. I thought about the year I'd had. The long hours, the constant juggling, the money I'd sent without question. I thought about how much I had pinned on this visit, on this holiday. I realized how desperately I had needed it to mean something more than just another obligation. My chest tightened as I turned onto my side, pulling the blanket closer. Sometime in the night, I heard a sound that made my eyes snap open. A low mechanical noise, distant but unmistakable. I sat up, listening. There it was again. The sound of the garage door opening. I held my breath, heart pounding, as the noise echoed through the house. I told myself it was nothing. Someone grabbing something. Someone stepping out for air. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to shift in a way I couldn't prepare for. I lay back down, staring into the darkness, my thoughts racing. Tomorrow was Christmas morning. Tomorrow, whatever this surprise was, would be revealed. I wanted to believe it wouldn't hurt. I wanted to believe I was wrong about everything. I whispered that hope to myself like a prayer, even as doubt curled tighter around my ribs. That night, as the house fell quiet again, I realized how much I had been holding on to the idea of fairness, how much of my strength came from believing that things would eventually balance out. I didn't know yet that I was standing on the edge of the moment that would finally prove how wrong that belief had been. All I knew was that the anticipation I felt wasn't excitement anymore, it was dread. And still, lying there in the dark, I told myself one last time that the surprise waiting downstairs couldn't possibly be meant to hurt me. The sound of the garage door opening cut through the quiet house like a blade, pulling me fully awake before I even understood why my heart was pounding. I sat up in bed, the blanket slipping from my shoulders, and listened as the low mechanical hum faded into silence. For a moment I told myself to lie back down. Christmas morning wasn't here yet. Whatever was happening could wait. But something inside me already knew it couldn't. I slipped out of bed and opened my door slowly, careful not to make a sound. The hallway was dim, lit only by the faint glow of a nightlight near the stairs. Each step felt heavier than the last as I moved toward the sound, my bare feet cold against the floor. I wasn't angry, not yet. I was bracing myself, the way you do when you sense an impact coming, but don't know from which direction. When I reached the top of the stairs, light spilled up from below. The garage door was fully open now, and the overhead lights were on. I paused, my hand resting on the banister, my breath shallow. Then I took another step, and another, until I could see it. The Ferrari sat in the center of the garage like it belonged there. Bright red and impossibly new, its surface gleaming under the lights. It looked unreal, like something placed on a stage rather than parked in a family garage. For a split second, my mind refused to accept what my eyes were seeing. It searched for an explanation. Any explanation that didn't involve the truth pressing against my ribs. My sister stood beside it, her arms crossed loosely, her face glowing with excitement she wasn't even trying to hide. My dad was there too, one hand resting proudly on the hood, smiling in a way I hadn't seen in a long time. They were talking, laughing softly, caught up in a moment that had nothing to do with me. I felt the floor tilt beneath my feet. No one noticed me at first. I stood there on the stairs, frozen, as the scene unfolded in front of me. The car wasn't wrapped or hidden. There were no balloons or bows, no sense that this was a reveal waiting for the right time. It had already happened. I was late to my own family's celebration. My sister laughed, a sound so light and free it almost hurt to hear. She reached out and touched the side mirror, her fingers trailing over the glossy surface. "I still can't believe it," she said, shaking her head. "It's perfect." My dad chuckled, pride clear in his voice. "You deserve something special," he replied. Those words landed in my chest with a dull, echoing thud. I stepped down the last few stairs, my presence finally registering. My dad glanced up surprised, then smiled like nothing was wrong. "You're up early," he said. My sister turned toward me, her smile faltering just slightly before snapping back into place. "Merry Christmas," she said brightly. "Merry Christmas. I wanted to ask 1,000 questions. I wanted to scream. I wanted to laugh at the absurdity of it all. Instead, I stood there, my hands clenched at my sides, staring at the car. My brain started doing what it always did when things felt overwhelming. It calculated rent, insurance, tuition, emergency transfers, late nights, double shifts. The numbers lined up in my head without effort, forming a total I knew by heart now. I didn't need to ask where the money came from. My body already knew. "Isn't it amazing?" my sister said, stepping closer to me, her eyes shining. "Dad surprised me." She said it like that explained everything, like the word surprised erased the cost. My dad nodded, beaming. "I wanted to do something big this year," he said. "Something memorable." He looked between us, then back at her. "She's been through a lot." I waited. I don't know what I was waiting for. An acknowledgement, a pause, a question, something. But it never came. No one asked how I felt. No one checked my face or noticed how still I had gone. It was as if I were a piece of furniture that had wandered into the frame by accident. A relative appeared at the doorway behind me, drawn by the noise and the light. "Wow," they said, eyes widening. "That's incredible." They laughed softly and glanced at me. "Must be nice to have a sister like you." I felt something inside me crack, slow and quiet. I managed a smile, the kind I had perfected over years of swallowing discomfort. My sister hugged my dad, her head resting against his shoulder. The scene looked like something out of a holiday commercial, all warmth and generosity and joy. I stood just outside it, watching through an invisible barrier. They started talking about practical things then, insurance, maintenance, where she would keep it. The words washed over me, familiar and foreign all at once. I listened as if from underwater, my ears ringing. Each sentence confirmed what I already knew. This hadn't been a spontaneous decision. This had been planned, budgeted, decided, without me. I drifted backward without anyone noticing, stepping out of the garage and into the cold morning air. The contrast made me shiver. I wrapped my arms around myself and stared at the driveway, my breath coming out in short puffs. The sky was pale, the world still and quiet, as if nothing monumental had just happened. After a moment, I walked back toward the car. I didn't know why. Maybe I needed to touch it, to make it real. My fingers brushed against the metal, cold and smooth under my skin. It felt impersonal, indifferent, just an object. And yet it carried the weight of every sacrifice I had made, every boundary I had ignored. Standing there, something shifted inside me. The shock began to settle into something heavier, something clearer. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was the natural result of a pattern I had been part of for years. I had funded a life I wasn't allowed to live. I went back inside quietly and climbed the stairs to my room. The house felt different now, smaller somehow. I closed the door behind me and leaned against it, my knees threatening to give out. I slid down to the floor and sat there in the dim light, my heart racing. I didn't cry right away. I felt numb, suspended in a space where emotion hadn't caught up yet. I replayed the scene in my head, searching for a moment where things could have gone differently. A moment where someone might have looked at me and realized what this meant. But there wasn't one. What hurt the most wasn't the money. It wasn't even the car. It was the ease with which it had all happened. The way my absence from the decision hadn't been questioned. The way my contribution had been assumed, absorbed, erased. I thought about every time I had said it was fine. Every time I had reassured them that I could handle it. I thought about how often I had been praised for being strong, for being reliable, for not needing much. Standing there in the garage, invisible and silent, I finally understood the cost of that praise. Downstairs, laughter drifted up again, soft and content. They were celebrating. I lay back on the bed and stared at the ceiling, my hands resting on my stomach, feeling my breath rise and fall. The house was full, and yet I had never felt more alone. That Ferrari didn't just show me how they had spent my money, it showed me exactly who I was to them. Not a daughter to be protected or considered. Not a partner in decisions. I was a resource, a means to an end. Useful as long as I kept giving. As the morning light grew brighter, I felt something else settle in alongside the hurt. A stillness. A clarity I hadn't allowed myself before. I had crossed an invisible line, and there was no going back to the comfort of denial. I didn't know yet what I was going to do. I didn't have a plan. But I knew this much as I lay there listening to the sounds of Christmas morning unfolding without me. I would never be able to unsee what I had seen. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't sure I wanted to. I stayed in my room longer than I should have, lying still on the bed as if that might stop the morning from moving forward without me. Downstairs, the house hummed with life, coffee brewing, cabinets opening and closing, laughter drifting up the stairs, light and unbothered. No one came to check on me. No knock on the door. No quiet question asking if I was okay. The celebration hadn't paused just because I was hurting, and that realization sank deeper than the shock itself. Eventually, I forced myself to get up. I washed my face, stared at my reflection in the mirror, and barely recognized the woman looking back at me. My eyes were dull, ringed with exhaustion that went far beyond lack of sleep. I told myself I needed water, that I needed air, that I couldn't stay hidden in this room forever. So I opened the door and stepped back into the hallway, my movements careful, controlled. As I made my way down the stairs, the voices became clearer. My dad and my sister were in the kitchen, their tones casual, unguarded. They didn't know I was there. I slowed without meaning to, stopping just before the last step, my hand resting on the wall. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop. I was just there. At least she loved it, my dad was saying, his voice warm with satisfaction. That's all that matters. My sister laughed softly. Of course I did. It's insane, Dad. I still feel like I'm dreaming. There was a pause, then she added, almost as an afterthought, Do you think she noticed? I felt my stomach drop. My dad sighed, not heavily, not with guilt, but with something closer to impatience. She wouldn't understand, he said. You know how she is. She overthinks everything. The words landed with a quiet finality that stole the air from my lungs. My sister didn't argue. She hummed in agreement, the sound light, almost amused. Yeah, she said. She always does. There was no malice in her voice, no hesitation, just certainty. They moved on after that, talking about mundane things, breakfast plans, a trip my sister wanted to take soon. The conversation flowed easily, untouched by what had just been said. I stood there, frozen, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure they could hear it. She wouldn't understand. In that moment, something inside me broke cleanly in two. I had spent years believing that if I just explained myself better, if I was patient enough, if I chose the right words, I could be understood. I had blamed myself every time my feelings were dismissed, telling myself I hadn't communicated clearly, that I had been too emotional or too vague. Hearing my dad say that sentence so casually stripped that belief away. It wasn't that I wouldn't understand, it was that they didn't think I deserved to. I backed away slowly, my movements quiet and deliberate. I didn't want them to know I'd heard. Not yet. I retreated up the stairs and closed my door behind me, leaning against it as my chest rose and fell in shallow breaths. My hands were shaking now, not from shock but from something colder and sharper. The Ferrari hadn't been the real betrayal. It was just the object that made everything visible. This conversation, these few unguarded words, were the truth I had been avoiding for years. They didn't see me as a daughter. They saw me as a function, someone who sent money, someone who solved problems, someone who absorbed stress so they didn't have to. My feelings weren't part of the equation. My understanding wasn't required. My role was to give, not to question. I walked to the mirror again and looked at myself, really looked. I saw all the versions of me that had shown up without complaint. The woman who worked late and smiled through exhaustion. The daughter who sent money and asked for nothing in return. The sister who cheered from the sidelines while quietly funding the game. I realized then how often I had said the words, "I understand." I had said them when I was tired, when I was hurt, when I felt overlooked. I had said them to keep the peace, to prove I was mature, to show I wasn't selfish. Those words had become my shield, and now I saw the cost of wearing it for so long. Understanding had never protected me. It had erased me. I sat on the edge of the bed and pressed my palms into the mattress, grounding myself. The anger I expected didn't come. Instead, there was a strange calm, the kind that settles in after a truth finally clicks into place. I wasn't furious. I was done lying to myself. I thought back over the years, replaying moments with new clarity. The way decisions were made without me. The way money disappeared without explanation. The way my concerns were brushed aside as stress or overthinking. It wasn't carelessness. It was design. They had built a system where my sacrifice was invisible and unquestioned, and I had helped them build it by never demanding more. Downstairs, the day carried on. Doors opened and closed. Plates clinked. The Ferrari was probably still gleaming in the garage, drawing admiration and excitement. I imagined my sister talking about where she would drive it first, my dad nodding along proudly. I imagined them existing comfortably inside a world I had paid for but wasn't invited to fully inhabit. I lay back on the bed and stared at the ceiling, my thoughts moving slowly now, deliberately. I wasn't spiraling. I was seeing. For the first time, I allowed myself to think something I had always pushed away. What if nothing I did would ever be enough? What if the problem wasn't that I hadn't given enough, but that giving was the only thing they valued? The realization hurt, but it was also freeing in a way I hadn't expected. If my worth in this family was tied to what I provided, then I had been chasing approval that was never meant to include me as a person. No amount of explanation would change that. I thought about confronting them right then, about walking downstairs and telling them I'd heard everything. The idea flickered and faded. There was no point. They hadn't said anything cruel. They hadn't raised their voices or insulted me. They had simply spoken the truth as they saw it. And that truth didn't include me. The rest of the morning passed in a blur. I stayed in my room until the house grew quieter, until the sounds of celebration dulled into routine. When I finally went downstairs, everyone acted normal, smiles, polite conversation. My sister avoided my eyes more than usual, but my dad was warm, almost cheerful. It was as if nothing significant had happened. I played along. I always had. But something inside me had shifted permanently. The words I had overheard replayed themselves again and again, not as a wound but as a warning. She wouldn't understand. The sentence echoed until it lost its sting and became something else entirely. Clarity. That night, back in the guest room, I lay awake listening to the quiet. I didn't feel the urge to cry. I didn't feel the need to justify myself. I felt resolved in a way that scared me just a little. I hadn't lost my family that Christmas morning. I had finally understood them. And once I understood, there was no way to go back to pretending I didn't. The morning after Christmas felt strangely ordinary, and that was what unsettled me the most. Sunlight filtered through the curtains like it always did, soft and pale, landing on the same furniture, the same walls, the same life that had existed before everything cracked open. Downstairs, I could hear the low hum of routine, coffee brewing, plates clinking. The house moved on as if nothing monumental had happened, as if a bright red Ferrari hadn't rewritten the meaning of my place in this family overnight. I lay there for a while, staring at the ceiling, listening. No one came to check on me. No one asked how I was feeling. The absence of concern wasn't loud or dramatic. It was quiet, seamless, and that made it undeniable. Whatever had broken inside me hadn't broken for them. When I finally got out of bed and went downstairs, the Ferrari was still there, visible through the garage door window, gleaming like a monument. My sister was already dressed, talking excitedly about taking it out later. My dad nodded along, sipping his coffee, relaxed in a way I hadn't seen in years. They looked content, complete. I realized then that the shock I felt wasn't something they shared. To them, this was just another good morning. I poured myself a cup of coffee and sat at the table, my movements slow, deliberate. No one spoke to me directly. Conversation flowed around me, never landing. I watched my sister laugh, watched my dad smile, and something inside me clicked into place with quiet finality. This wasn't about a car. It never had been. As the day went on, memories began surfacing without invitation, lining themselves up in my mind like pieces of a puzzle I had refused to assemble. I remembered the first time I sent money home, how proud I had felt. The first holiday I missed because I picked up an extra shift. The first time I told myself it was fine, that I didn't need much anyway. Each moment, insignificant on its own, now glowed with new meaning. I remembered a birthday years ago when my sister had been surprised with something she wanted, while my gift was a hug and a thank you for understanding. I remembered standing in my tiny apartment on the phone with my dad, reassuring him that yes, I could cover it, even though my stomach had dropped when I checked my balance. I remembered how often my exhaustion had been reframed as ambition, how my stress had been brushed off as overthinking. None of it had felt cruel at the time. That was the part that hurt the most. There had been no villain twirling a mustache, no dramatic declarations. Just a steady, unspoken agreement that I would give, and they would take, and we would all call it love. The phrase, "You're the strong one," echoed in my head, stripped of its comforting tone. I had always worn that label like armor, believing it meant I was respected. But sitting there at the table, watching my family orbit around a life I had funded but never been invited to enjoy, I saw it for what it really was. It wasn't praise, it was permission. Permission for them to lean harder. Permission to worry less about me. Permission to assume I would always catch them when they fell. Being the strong one had never meant being protected. It had meant being expendable. I excused myself and went for a walk, needing space to breathe. The winter air was sharp against my face, grounding. As I walked through familiar streets, I let the memories come, no longer pushing them away. Every time my family had faced a financial scare, I had been the solution. Every time my sister needed space to explore, I had been the safety net. When things went wrong, I was reliable. When things went right, I was invisible. The Ferrari wasn't an exception to the pattern. It was the most honest expression of it. That realization settled into me slowly, like a deep ache rather than a sharp pain. I thought about how many times I had defended them to myself, to others. How often I had said they didn't mean it, that they were just stressed, that family was complicated. I had become their translator, their excuse maker, their emotional buffer. Intent doesn't erase impact. The sentence formed in my mind with startling clarity. Maybe my dad hadn't intended to hurt me. Maybe my sister hadn't set out to exploit me. But the result was the same. I was drained, overlooked, and expected to smile through it. Love that requires you to disappear isn't love. It's a transaction disguised as loyalty. When I returned to the house, the mood hadn't changed. Plans were being made. My sister was talking about where she wanted to drive later, which friends she might show the car to. No one asked if I wanted to join. No one wondered if I had other plans. I realized then how often my presence had been optional, my contributions essential, and my feelings irrelevant. I went upstairs and sat on the bed, pulling my phone out of my pocket. I opened my banking app without hesitation this time. The familiar list of scheduled transfers stared back at me, neat and orderly, like a promise I had made to someone else's life. For the first time, I didn't feel pride or obligation when I looked at it. I felt distance. I thought about the years ahead if nothing changed. More shifts, more transfers, more moments where my needs were quietly sidelined because I was capable. I thought about how easy it would be to keep going, to keep choosing the familiar discomfort over the terrifying unknown. I had done that my whole life. But I also thought about how tired I was. Not just physically, but deep down, in the part of me that had been holding my breath for years. I didn't delete anything. I didn't cancel anything. I wasn't ready for that yet. But I stared at the screen and let myself think a dangerous thought. This stops. Not today. Not with a dramatic announcement. But soon. This doesn't go on forever. For the rest of the day, I watched my family with new eyes. I saw how easily my absence from conversations went unnoticed, how quickly financial worries were mentioned, then brushed aside with the unspoken assumption that things would work out. They always had, after all. I had made sure of it. That night, lying in bed, I felt strangely calm. The anger I expected never arrived. In its place was something steadier. Acceptance. Not of the situation, but of the truth. I had been playing a role that no longer fit, and no amount of explaining or sacrificing would reshape it. I thought about who I had been before this role took over. The woman who moved to a new city on her own. The woman who had dreams that didn't involve holding everyone else together. She hadn't disappeared. She had just been buried under years of responsibility. The realization was both painful and liberating. Painful because it meant admitting how long I had allowed this to happen. Liberating because it meant I could choose differently. The Ferrari no longer felt like a punch to the chest. It felt like a signpost, a moment so undeniable that it forced me to stop pretending. It had shown me the pattern in full color, impossible to ignore. As the house grew quiet and the day finally ended, I lay awake thinking about boundaries, a concept that had always felt selfish to me before. Now it felt necessary. Loving my family didn't have to mean sacrificing myself. Being a daughter didn't have to mean being a provider. I didn't know exactly how or when things would change. I only knew that they had to. The pattern was clear now, etched into my memory with painful precision. And once you see a pattern for what it is, you can't unsee it. The next step would come soon enough. I could feel it, waiting just beyond the edge of my fear. And for the first time in a long time, that fear didn't paralyze me. It told me I was finally waking up. I woke up before anyone else that morning, the house wrapped in a kind of stillness that felt unfamiliar. The sky outside was still dark, the world holding its breath. I sat up slowly, listening to the quiet, and for the first time in days, my thoughts didn't scatter. They lined up, calm, clear. This wasn't the morning after a fight or a dramatic confrontation. This was the morning after understanding, and understanding had changed everything. I went downstairs and sat alone at the kitchen table, the same table where I had eaten countless meals, listened to conversations that circled around me, nodded along while decisions were made without my input. A faint smell of coffee lingered in the air from the night before. I wrapped my hands around an empty mug, grounding myself in the moment. My phone lay on the table in front of me, screen dark, waiting. For years, my mornings had started with calculations. how many hours I could work, how much I could send, what I could afford to give up this month. That morning, for the first time, the question was different. Not how can I help them, but how do I stop hurting myself? I unlocked my phone and opened my banking app. The familiar numbers stared back at me, tidy and obedient. Scheduled transfers, automatic payments, the quiet machinery that kept my family's life running smoothly. I scrolled slowly, feeling my chest rise and fall. There was no panic, no rush, just a steady awareness of what these numbers represented. I thought about every justification I had ever used. They need me. It's temporary. This is what family does. Those words had carried me through years of exhaustion. They had also kept me trapped. I hovered my finger over the next scheduled transfer, my heart pounding softly. Not with fear, but with gravity. This wasn't about punishment. It wasn't about revenge. It was about truth. I canceled it. The screen refreshed. The transfer disappeared. Nothing exploded. The house didn't shake. The world didn't end. I sat there, staring at my phone, waiting for something terrible to happen. Nothing did. What I felt instead was lighter than I expected. Not joy, not relief, just space. A quiet opening where obligation used to live. I set my phone down and let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding for years. Footsteps sounded on the stairs. My dad entered the kitchen a few minutes later, rubbing his eyes, still half asleep. He smiled when he saw me. "You're up early," he said casually, reaching for the coffee pot. The normalcy of it all almost made me laugh. For a moment I wondered if I could keep this to myself, if I could let the change stay invisible a little longer. But that wasn't how boundaries worked, and I was done hiding. "Can we talk later?" I asked, my voice steady. He paused, glancing at me with mild surprise, then nodded. "Sure," he said. "Everything okay?" "Yes," I replied. And for once, I meant it. The conversation happened later that afternoon, when the house was quieter. My sister was out, the Ferrari no doubt drawing attention somewhere else. My dad and I sat across from each other in the living room, the Christmas decorations still up, twinkling softly. The setting felt surreal, like the world hadn't caught up to the shift that had already happened inside me. He started, as he always did, by asking about work. I answered briefly, not offering more than necessary. When there was a pause, I spoke. "I'm not going to be sending money anymore," I said. The words hung in the air between us, simple and unadorned. He frowned slightly, clearly not understanding at first. "What do you mean?" he asked. "Is something wrong?" "No," I said again. "Nothing's wrong, I just can't do it anymore." His expression shifted, confusion giving way to concern. "But we've been relying on that," he said, his tone still calm, still reasonable. "You know things are tight right now." I nodded. "I know." There it was, the familiar opening. The place where I would usually step in, apologize, explain, reassure. Instead, I stayed quiet, letting the silence stretch. After a moment, he sighed. "We're family," he said, leaning back in his chair. "We help each other. That's how it works." I had expected those words. They didn't hit the way they used to. "I can still love you," I said slowly, choosing each word with care. "But I can't keep funding everyone else's life at the expense of my own." He stared at me, clearly unsettled now. "After everything we've done for you?" he asked, not accusing, just stating it, as if it were a fact that explained everything. I felt the old guilt stir, the reflex to defend myself, to list everything I had given, everything I had sacrificed. I let the feeling pass without acting on it. "I'm not saying you didn't do anything for me," I said. "I'm saying this isn't sustainable for me anymore." He shook his head slightly, frustration creeping into his voice. "You're being dramatic," he said. "It's just money. We'll figure it out." That was the moment it became painfully clear. To him, it really was just money. To me, it had been years of my life. "I've already figured it out," I replied quietly. The conversation didn't explode. There was no shouting, no tears, just a growing tension, a realization on his face that something fundamental had changed. He tried a few more times, circling back to familiar phrases: family, responsibility, understanding. Each time I listened without interrupting, then repeated my boundary without embellishment, no explanations, no apologies. Eventually he fell silent. The disappointment in his eyes was unmistakable. But so was something else: confusion. He didn't know how to interact with me outside the role I had always played. I stood up when it was clear the conversation was going nowhere else. "I'm going to start packing," I said. "I'll be leaving soon." That finally got a reaction. "Leaving?" he echoed. "Over this?" I paused, looking at him, really looking. "Not over this," I said. "Because of this." Upstairs, I began gathering my things. Not frantically, not angrily, methodically. Each item I placed in my bag felt like a small reclaiming: my clothes, my books, the pieces of my life that belonged to me and no one else. The house was quieter than it had been all week, the silence thick with unspoken resentment. My sister returned while I was packing. She hovered in the doorway, arms crossed, her excitement from the day before replaced with something harder. "Are you really doing this?" she asked. I met her gaze. "Yes," she scoffed lightly. "You're overreacting," she said. "You always do this." I felt a strange sadness then, not for myself, but for how deeply ingrained the narrative was. "Maybe," I said, "but this is what I need." She rolled her eyes and walked away without another word. No apology, no curiosity, just dismissal. And somehow, that hurt less than it once would have. By the time I zipped my bag closed, the house no longer felt like mine. It felt like a place I had passed through, a role I had outgrown. I stood in the doorway of the guest room for a moment, taking one last look. Not with nostalgia, but with clarity. I wasn't leaving because I hated them. I was leaving because staying meant erasing myself. As I carried my bag down the stairs, no one stopped me. No one asked me to stay. My dad stood in the kitchen, staring at the counter. My sister was nowhere to be seen. The front door opened easily, the cold air rushing in to meet me. Outside I paused, breathing deeply. The weight I had been carrying for so long felt different now. Heavier in some ways, lighter in others. Boundaries always come with a cost. I was paying it now. But as I walked toward my car, keys in hand, I knew something with absolute certainty. I hadn't lost their support. I had lost the illusion that it had ever been unconditional. And for the first time in my life, that loss felt like freedom. The first night on my own was quieter than I expected. The kind of quiet that doesn't rush to fill itself. I sat on the edge of the bed in the small apartment I had rented months ago but barely used, my suitcase still half open on the floor. The space smelled faintly of detergent and new beginnings, unfamiliar but not hostile. Outside, traffic hummed in the distance, a steady reminder that life was moving forward whether I was ready or not. I didn't cry that night. That surprised me. I had imagined tears, shaking hands, regret crashing in waves the moment the door closed behind me. Instead, there was a heavy calm, the kind that settles after a long illness finally breaks. I lay back on the mattress and stared at the ceiling, listening to my own breathing. For the first time in years, there was no one else's anxiety riding on my chest. No expectation waiting for me to fix something by morning. The next few days unfolded slowly, cautiously, like a body relearning how to walk after years of strain. I went to work as usual, clocked in, did my job. My coworkers noticed something was different. They asked if I was tired, if everything was okay. I smiled and said yes, because in a strange way it was true. I was exhausted, but the exhaustion felt honest now, earned for myself instead of spent on someone else's needs. At night, my phone stayed quiet at first. Then the messages started. They were subtle in the beginning. A missed call from my dad, a short text asking if I had arrived safely. I didn't respond right away. Not out of spite, but because I needed time to sit with my own emotions without absorbing theirs. When I finally replied, I kept it simple. I'm fine. I need space. The next message came from my sister. It wasn't concerned, it was sharp. "So you're really doing this?" she wrote. "Over money?" I stared at the screen, the old reflex kicking in, the urge to explain myself into exhaustion. I typed a long response, then deleted it. Typed again, deleted again. Finally, I wrote something short. "It's not about the money." She didn't reply. As the week went on, the tone shifted. Concern gave way to frustration. Frustration turned into guilt. I was told they were struggling, that things were stressful, that I had always been the one they could count on. Each message was wrapped in familiarity, in the language of obligation I knew so well. And for the first time, I didn't unravel under it. I started noticing things I had never had time to notice before, the way my shoulders felt lighter when I woke up, the way I could sit with a cup of coffee and not feel rushed, the way silence no longer felt like something I needed to fill by being useful. One evening, after a long shift, I stopped at a grocery store near my apartment. I wandered the aisles slowly, choosing food based on what I wanted, not what was practical or cheap or easy to stretch. I stood in front of the freezer section, smiling at something as simple as that choice. It felt small. It felt enormous. At home, I cooked dinner for myself, music playing softly in the background. I ate at the counter, alone but not lonely, savoring each bite. The realization came quietly, almost shyly. This is what my life feels like when I'm not constantly bracing for someone else's crisis. The guilt still visited, usually late at night. It whispered familiar questions. Are they okay without you? Are you selfish? Are you abandoning them? I didn't try to silence those thoughts. I let them come and go, examining them instead of obeying them. Guilt, I realized, wasn't proof that I was wrong. It was proof that I was changing. A week after I left, my dad called again. I answered this time. His voice was tired, stripped of its usual authority. He asked how I was doing, then moved quickly into updates. Bills, repairs, stress. I listened without interrupting, my chest tightening as old instinct stirred. When he finished, there was a pause, heavy with expectation. I can't help with that, I said calmly. Silence. You really mean it, he finally said. Yes. There was something like disbelief in his tone, as if he had been waiting for me to cave, to step back into place. You're putting us in a difficult position, he said. I closed my eyes briefly, grounding myself. I've been in a difficult position for a long time, I replied. I'm not doing that anymore. He didn't argue. He didn't apologize. He simply ended the call a few minutes later, polite but distant. When the line went dead, I felt the familiar ache of disappointment. But it was softer now, muted by understanding. They weren't angry because they missed me. They were angry because the system no longer worked. Over the next few weeks, my life began to fill itself in new ways. I signed up for a class I had always wanted to take but never had time for. I reconnected with friends I had drifted away from, surprised by how easily the laughter returned. I started running in the mornings, feeling my body grow stronger, more responsive. Each small act of care felt like stitching myself back together. One afternoon, as I walked home from work, I passed a red sports car stopped at a light. For a split second, my chest tightened. Then the light changed, and the car sped away, disappearing into traffic. I stood there on the sidewalk, breathing evenly, waiting for the familiar rush of anger or sadness. It didn't come. The Ferrari had lost its power over me. It was still a symbol, yes, but no longer one that controlled my emotions. It was a reminder of a boundary drawn, a line I had finally refused to cross again. The injustice hadn't vanished, but it no longer defined me. I began to understand something deeper then. Healing wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic. It happened in quiet choices, repeated daily. Choosing not to explain myself. Choosing not to rescue. Choosing rest over obligation. One night, sitting on my couch with the lights low, I realized I hadn't checked my bank balance obsessively in days. I wasn't calculating how much I could spare. I wasn't bracing for the next request. The money I earned stayed where it was, steady, unclaimed. For the first time, my future felt like something I could plan for myself. That didn't mean I stopped loving my family. Love didn't evaporate just because boundaries appeared. But it changed shape. It became something that didn't require me to disappear. There were moments of grief. Holidays would feel different now. Phone calls would be shorter. The version of family I had clung to was gone. I let myself mourn that without trying to replace it. Loss deserved space, too. As the days passed, I felt myself becoming someone new, or maybe someone very old returning. The woman who knew her limits. The woman who understood that being needed wasn't the same as being loved. The woman who could stand alone without collapsing. One evening, as I prepared for bed, my phone buzzed with a message from my sister. It was brief. "Dad's upset. He says you've changed." I stared at the words, then typed back, "I hope so." I set the phone down and turned off the light curling under the blankets. Outside, the city moved, alive and indifferent. Inside, I felt a quiet certainty settle in my bones. This was the cost of choosing myself. And for the first time, it felt worth paying. The invitation came in the mail on a gray Thursday afternoon, slipped between a utility bill and an advertisement I didn't bother to open. The envelope was familiar, my father's handwriting neat and deliberate, as if every letter had been carefully placed. I stood in the hallway of my apartment for a long moment, staring at my name, feeling an old tension tighten in my chest before I even opened it. It was an invitation to a family dinner. No apology, no explanation, just a date, a time, and a quiet assumption that I would show up, that I would step back into my place as if nothing had changed. The audacity of it almost made me laugh. Almost. I set the envelope down on the counter and walked away from it, letting it sit there untouched for the rest of the evening. I cooked dinner, folded laundry, answered emails. I lived my life while that piece of paper waited, heavy with expectation. The difference now was that the expectation no longer owned me. Later that night, I finally opened it. The message inside was brief, polite, and painfully neutral. "We should talk. We're still family." I read those words slowly, feeling how little power they held over me now. Once they would have pulled me back instantly, wrapped in guilt and obligation. Now they felt like a test. I didn't respond right away. The days that followed were quiet but charged. I could sense something shifting on the other side of the distance I had created. The messages from my dad became shorter, more clipped. My sister stopped texting altogether. The silence wasn't peaceful this time. It was strategic. When I finally agreed to meet, I chose a public place. A small restaurant halfway between my apartment and their house. Neutral ground. I arrived early and sat by the window, watching people pass by, grounding myself in the simple reality of my own life. I reminded myself why I was there. Not to apologize, not to fix, just to be honest. They arrived together. My dad looked older than I remembered, his posture slightly stooped, his expression tight. My sister followed a step behind, her arms crossed, her gaze guarded. We exchanged brief greetings and sat down, the air thick with everything we weren't saying. For a few minutes, we talked about nothing. The weather, work, traffic. It felt like a performance we all knew by heart. Finally, my dad cleared his throat and leaned forward. "This has gone far enough," he said. I didn't flinch. "What has?" "This distance," he replied. "This tension. You've made things very difficult." There it was. Not "how are you?" Not "I'm sorry you were hurt." Just difficulty, inconvenience. "I didn't create this," I said evenly. "I just stopped pretending it wasn't happening." My sister scoffed softly, shaking her head. "You always do this," she said. "You take everything so personally." I looked at her, really looked. For the first time, I didn't feel the urge to defend myself or prove my pain. "It was personal," I said. "It was my money, my time, my life." My dad sighed, rubbing his temples. "We never asked you to feel this way," he said. "No," I replied. "You just benefited from it." Silence fell between us, heavy and uncomfortable. My dad shifted in his seat, clearly frustrated. "Families help each other," he said again, as if repetition might restore its power. "That's what you're supposed to do." "And I did," I said. "For years. I helped until there was nothing left of me." My sister leaned forward then, her voice sharp. "So what? You think you're better than us now?" The old me would have panicked at that question. The old me would have rushed to reassure her, to make myself smaller. Instead, I took a breath. "No," I said. "I think I'm allowed to live." That was when the masks finally slipped. My dad's voice hardened. "You're being selfish." There it was, the word that had haunted me my entire life, the accusation that kept me in line. I felt it echo through my chest, trying to find purchase. It didn't. "Maybe," I said calmly, "but I'm done being selfless in a way that destroys me." My sister pushed her chair back slightly, arms tightening across her chest. "You know we're struggling," she said, "and you just don't care." I met her eyes. "I care," I said. "I just don't exist to fix it anymore." The conversation unraveled after that. They listed everything they had done for me, every sacrifice, every expense, every moment of support. I listened without interrupting, letting them say it all. When they finished, I nodded. "I'm grateful," I said, "but gratitude isn't a lifetime contract." That seemed to land somewhere deep, because neither of them spoke for a long moment. My dad finally looked at me, something uncertain flickering in his eyes. "So, what do you want?" he asked. The question surprised me, not because it was unreasonable, but because it was the first time anyone had asked it sincerely. "I want a relationship where I'm seen as more than a resource," I said. "I want honesty. I want boundaries. And if that's not possible, then I want distance." My sister laughed bitterly. "You're really serious about this?" "Yes," I said. "I am." The check came shortly after, the conversation exhausted, stripped down to its rawest truth. My dad paid, a small gesture that felt almost symbolic. As we stood to leave, there was an awkward pause, the kind that comes when everyone knows something has ended but doesn't know how to name it. "I hope you come to your senses," my dad said quietly. I nodded. "I already have." Outside, the cold air hit my face, sharp and clarifying. I watched them walk away together, their shoulders angled toward each other, a unit I was no longer part of. There was a familiar ache in my chest, but it wasn't regret. It was grief. Grief for the family I had wanted, not the one I had. That night, back in my apartment, I sat alone with the lights off, city glow spilling in through the windows. I let myself feel everything, the sadness, the anger, the relief. Healing wasn't linear, and I didn't expect it to be. But something had shifted permanently. I no longer wondered if I had overreacted. I no longer replayed the conversation, searching for ways to soften myself. I had spoken my truth without shrinking, and that mattered more than their response. In the weeks that followed, contact dwindled. Birthdays passed quietly. Holidays were smaller, lonelier, but also lighter. I filled the space with friends, with routines, with plans that belonged to me alone. I started saving for things I wanted, not emergencies that weren't mine to solve. One evening, as I balanced my budget, I realized something that made me pause. For the first time in my adult life, my future felt stable, not because I was holding everything together, but because I wasn't. The Ferrari became a distant memory, no longer a symbol of rage or betrayal. It had become a turning point, a moment that forced me to see the truth I had spent years avoiding. I hadn't lost my family because I set boundaries. I had discovered who they were when I did. And as painful as that knowledge was, it gave me something I had never truly had before: freedom. The first real sign that my life had changed came on an ordinary Sunday morning, the kind I used to dread because it reminded me of everything I hadn't done for everyone else yet. I woke up without an alarm, sunlight spilling softly across the floor of my apartment, and for once my chest wasn't tight with urgency. There were no messages waiting, no unspoken emergencies hovering over my head. Just quiet. Honest. Earned quiet. I lay there for a while, listening to the sounds of the city waking up outside my window, cars passing, a neighbor's footsteps in the hallway. Somewhere, someone laughing. Life moving forward without asking anything from me. And instead of feeling left behind, I felt included in it for the first time. I got up and made coffee slowly, savoring the small ritual. The mug warmed my hands as I stood by the window, watching the street below. I thought about how many mornings I had started like this before, except back then my mind would already be racing. Bills, transfers, promises I had made without realizing they were promises forever. That woman felt far away now, like someone I had once known but outgrown. The weeks since the dinner with my family hadn't been easy, but they had been clear. There were days when guilt tried to sneak back in, wearing familiar disguises. Family should stick together. You're strong enough to help. They need you. Each time I acknowledged the thought, then let it pass. Strength, I had learned, didn't mean sacrificing myself until there was nothing left. It meant knowing when to stop. I began filling my life with things that belonged only to me. I rearranged the apartment, moving furniture just because I wanted to. I signed up for a weekend class I'd always been curious about. I said no more often, and yes, more intentionally. Each choice felt like reclaiming a small piece of myself that had been put on hold for years. One afternoon, I found myself standing in front of a mirror, adjusting my coat before heading out, and I paused. There was something different in my eyes. Not happiness exactly, but presence. I was here, fully, not split between my life and everyone else's expectations. I smiled at my reflection. A soft, genuine smile that surprised me. I didn't hate my family. That truth mattered to me. Letting go of the role I played didn't mean erasing love. It meant accepting reality. Some relationships survive boundaries, others don't. And the ones that fall apart when you stop giving endlessly were never built on balance to begin with. There were moments when memories resurfaced unexpectedly. A holiday song in a store. A flash of red from a passing car. The image of a Ferrari still existed in my mind, but it no longer carried the same weight. It wasn't a wound anymore. It was a marker. A line in my life that said before and after. Before, I measured my worth by how much I could carry. After, I measured it by how well I could breathe. I realized something else, slowly and gently. I wasn't invisible anymore because I had stopped making myself that way. I had mistaken being needed for being loved, and once I untangled those two things, everything changed. Love didn't demand my exhaustion. Love didn't require silence. Love didn't punish boundaries. One evening, I sat at my desk, reviewing my finances, and felt a quiet pride settle over me. Not because the numbers were impressive, but because they were mine. My work, my effort, my future. For the first time, I wasn't planning around emergencies that weren't my responsibility. I was planning for joy. I started thinking about the woman I wanted to be in 10 years. Not the one who holds everything together for everyone else, but the one who chooses herself without apology. The one who builds relationships based on mutual respect, not obligation. The one who knows her value even when no one is clapping. There was grief, yes. I won't pretend there wasn't. I grieved the fantasy of a family that would one day see me, appreciate me, protect me. I grieved the years I spent believing that if I just tried harder, everything would be fair. That grief deserved space, and I gave it that space, without letting it pull me backward. What surprised me most was how much lighter my heart felt when I stopped waiting for validation that was never coming. I didn't need an apology to move forward. I didn't need understanding from people who had already decided I wouldn't understand. I needed honesty with myself, and I finally had it. On another quiet morning, as I walked through a park near my apartment, watching leaves shift under my feet, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Gratitude. Not for what I had endured, but for what I had chosen. For the courage it took to say no. For the strength it took to walk away. For the life that was now unfolding in front of me, Imperfect, but real. I wasn't the daughter who saved the family anymore. I was the woman who saved herself. And that, I realized, was enough. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever felt invisible in your own family, or pressured to give until there was nothing left, I'd really love to hear your thoughts. Share your experience in the comments, or tell me what part of this journey stayed with you the most. Your voice matters here. If you found meaning in this story, please take a moment to like it and subscribe to the channel. It helps us continue telling stories about boundaries, self-worth, and the courage it takes to choose yourself. Stay with us, because sometimes the quietest decisions lead to the most powerful transformations.